Now, I think a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere would be rather surprised to find that Lincoln has been a subject of attack, that his reputation had seemed, let's say, at least secure. Seems to have been lauded. Most people would have regarded him until very recently as being an unassailable figure. Like
Yes.
some others that we're talking about in this series, like Churchill, say. I think a lot of people would be surprised that he's actually been subjected over some years to a sort of process of pulling down.
Yes. Well, you have to remember that for a large plurality of the country, not a majority, but Southern sympathizers, which have continued to exist from 1861 onward, have always despised Lincoln, even despite the efforts of some Southerners, white supremacists, to claim him as one of their own. That's a little too perverse for my taste, but remained hostile to him on ideological grounds. This is especially a phenomenon of the old right, as we call it here, the paleo-conservatives, who saw in Lincoln this kind of grotesque exertion of executive power. Of course, he was a wartime president. He did all kinds of things that no president would do in peacetime. But they also claimed that he was the father of big government. He instituted the first income tax. He did a lot of extra constitutional things. He canceled the writ of habeas corpus, which of course is one of the foundation stones of a free government. He spent all kinds of money that wasn't authorized by Congress and so on. And so he, as for those people, become kind of a symbol of overweening government, of the kind of government that won't leave you alone, hyper-regulatory, endlessly expansive.
Is that really why they dislike him?
Well, I think you could make the case that that's kind of a dodge in the sense that they really don't like his racial policies. I mean, I think...
I mean, it's strange to talk about a figure who died more than 150 years ago and dislike him because of big government.
Oh, yeah, but it's quite a serious thing. I mean, it's a small group of people, but they're libertarians and libertarian organizations who are dedicated to the proposition, as it were, that Lincoln inaugurated big government and made people turn to government first rather than to their own devices. And I think that's a totally perverse reading of what Lincoln did. I remember I was at an anti-Lincoln conference, which was mostly right-wingers, with a few left-wingers. This was about 10 years ago. And there was a book, lots of books there. They also had a T-shirt, I'll never forget it, said, you think our problems started in the 60s? You're right, the 1860s. And that sort of summarizes the old right view of...
And is there no concession in that argument for the fact that the Civil War was going on?
Usually not, no.
I mean, it's sort of stunning that...
No, you try and explain that these are wartime powers. And by the time, Lincoln, of course, was killed at the end of the war, but by 1870, 1872, the income tax had been rolled back. A lot of the, of course, habeas corpus was reinstated. There were all kinds of the excesses of big government that were required as war actions were rolled back. And essentially the government, even under Lincoln, wasn't much bigger than the government under Calvin Coolidge, say, 60, 70 years later.
And just spread out a little as well, the residue of that Southern critique of Lincoln that's still there. How much of it still exists?
Well, now I think, those guys have been pretty well beaten down over the last 15 years, especially. And they don't get much airtime. However, you can take the essentials of their critique about the kind of man Lincoln was and see all of it in the left-wing attacks from the 1960s on Lincoln, that Lincoln was in fact a racist, he was a white supremacist, hated black people, was totally fine with slavery, never had an intention of doing away with slavery. Those are the standard critiques that you would get on the left of Lincoln, and the seminal work there is a book by a man named Lerone Bennett, who was the editor of Ebony magazine, a very popular magazine of the 60s and 70s and 80s with the black audience. And he kind of used Ebony as a pulpit to disabuse his audience of any thought that Abraham Lincoln was Father Abraham, or actually a great man who had the interests of black people at heart.
So the same critique was coming
From left and right. Yeah.
from left and right about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And the Southern right said this first, obviously, but then it gets picked up by the left in almost exactly the same terms.
Right. W.E.B. Du Bois despised Lincoln, and he was a great civil rights writer and thinker of the early 20th century, kind of a genius actually, but he bequeathed to the left this view of Lincoln as kind of a wily, a politician before all else, completely insincere in just about everything he said, always manipulating, and especially with a special hostility for black people. And that's become kind of a legacy of Du Bois and others.
It seems always that these critiques of Lincoln tell us more about the communities making the groups making the claims than they do about Lincoln.
Yeah. I actually talked to Lerone Bennett. He died about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. The man who was the editor of Ebony, about it, and pointed out, I've been hanging out with these neo-Confederates, and I got to say that what you're saying about Lincoln is they'd be like, yeah, and he was really kind of offended and taken back by that. It hadn't occurred to him, even though he was a very well-read man and who had thought about this quite a bit. He was kind of surprised that there was this Venn diagram overlap in the interpretation of Lincoln between white supremacists and the left-wing critique.